Hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar hosted by PSC. I'm the managing editor of PSC, Luana. We are here today with Fraser King, Head of Mobility Identity and Location Insights at Vodafone Enterprise, Stephen Lees, Managing Director of Citi Logik, and Daniel Clark, Smart Cities Program Manager at Cambridgeshire County Council. We're here today to talk about the collaboration between Vodafone, Citi Logik, and local authorities and how you can get involved, how this can benefit you. So just to start off, let me just remind the audience that you're welcome to write down any questions that you want them to answer. Just scroll down to the bottom of your screen. There's a little form where you can write down questions. And if they don't get to answer it live here today, they'll be happy to take your questions offline. So would you guys like to tell me a little bit about yourselves? Fraser, starting with you.
Yeah, sure. So Fraser King, as you mentioned, I head up a business unit in Vodafone UK called Location Insight. That was a business that we set up a number of years ago to look at how do we start to develop product services and kind of insight from some of the data that's produced by the mobile network.
Stephen, please.
Yeah, hi. My name is Stephen Lees. I'm the MD of Citi Logik. We've been working with Vodafone for the last 7 years, although operationally for 3 years. Our expertise is in understanding movement by vehicle, by foot, by public transport, and we use the existing 3-4G network to achieve that.
Daniel?
I'm Dan Clark. I work on the Smart Cambridge programme. So we're looking at how new emerging technologies, connectivity and data can help us to deliver services better across the county and also address some of the real challenges that we face as an area.
Okay, perfect. So I think a good way to start is, what do each of you hope to get out of this webinar today, and what do you hope the audience can take home with them from this discussion? What's your main goal? Why are you here? Fraser, start with you.
Look, I mean, so for me, Vodafone, significant player inside of the work that we do with local government and central government. So we, government are a big client of ours. We're doing a large amount of work in all kinds of areas that are relevant to government, connectivity, smart cities, Internet of Things. But really today is to talk about how some of the kind of the data and the insight products and the partnerships that we are developing in the kind of smart city domain, to share some of those, that experience, that understanding, and help local government understand some of the work that we're doing in that space.
Yeah, from my perspective, for the last 3 years, we've done some remarkable projects with Vodafone, 30 to 40 of those. And we're now into this world of post-GDPR with an opportunity to really take this to the next level. And I think with the new Digital Economy Act, with the support of the Information Commissioner's Office, and with new guidelines coming out from places like such as DFT, we really have a chance now to take this to the next level.
Brilliant. So what do you, as the only public sector person here, what do you hope to get out of this, and what do you hope other councils can learn?
So we think the data is going to underpin most of the work that we kind of do going forwards. It's really key to a lot of the services that we deliver. We're really keen to collaborate with business and academia because we don't think we can do it on our own. So we always find these discussions really useful. We like to hear about the work that companies are doing, but also we want to share our experience and what we've learned so far with other local authorities, because actually we don't want to be replicating it across the country. We really need to learn from what each other are doing so that we can really begin to develop the way that we use data in a way that can be replicated.
Well, so Dan, you come from Cambridgeshire County Council. You have the best insights on how do you think the needs of citizens in and around urban areas have changed in recent years? What's spurring this change?
So I think fundamentally the needs of residents within cities haven't changed, but actually the way that they're moving around cities, the way that they're accessing services is changing. There's this shift towards digital service delivery, and that's underpinned by connectivity. So it's really important that residents have the connectivity they need to be able to access services or applications. So we've been doing quite a lot of work looking at planning, travel planning applications. We need good high-speed broadband so that people can work from home, so that they don't need to travel. And we're also beginning to see things like connected healthcare in people's homes. So again, connectivity is really important there.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds quite difficult to achieve, but actually we can do it with the infrastructure that we currently have. So I guess this is one for you too. Stephen, maybe you'd like to start. How can existing infrastructure be used to deliver these changes to the ways we work and live and move around and access services?
Yeah, so I think firstly we have to accept that the current infrastructure, as in transport infrastructure, is reaching its capacity. We've seen a significant decrease last year in travel times. The trade unions have indicated it's 1 to 1.5 minutes per individual per day. So we're not going to be able to do things the way we've traditionally done them. We're going to have to undertake some modal shift. But the other thing is the thinking outside the box. I mean, the infrastructure that exists, 3, 4G, which I'm sure Fraser will talk about now, has a potential to be used much more creatively than it's ever done in the past. And a lot of the regulation around that is also reinforcing that as an opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, it's as part of this program, we've effectively turned our mobile network into a sort of a giant sort of transport and infrastructure sensor. So as mobile phones, mobile devices are moving around, transport systems, infrastructure, the community, you're able to derive insight from them. So we're sort of repurposing this kind of network infrastructure we've had to help local government understand more about how people kind of move around. And I totally agree with you, right? I mean, I think everyone would accept that the transport infrastructure in this country is under a huge amount of strain. People's lifestyles, behaviour have changed. We no longer go to the same place of work, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. We're far more transient. We work from home, we work from different places, but then we're also kind of impacted heavily by changing environmental conditions, ageing rail stock, some of these things. So I totally agree that the existing infrastructure is not going to be able to deliver the returns that it once did. So finding new and alternative ways, I think, of understanding the way in which people interact with cities and doing things differently is absolutely the core of where we need to be heading.
That's all well and good, but from my perspective, as editor of PSC, I know one question that will be on people's minds is, and on yours, local government. It's really no secret that local government is short on cash. Everybody knows this. A lot of councils are actually almost declaring bankruptcy at this point. So how would you sell this idea to them? How can you really help them deliver more for less money in a time of austerity, difficult decisions having to be made? How would you sell this idea to them?
Yeah, I think firstly I would say it's not as though we aren't doing a lot of things at the moment, maybe less efficiently than we should. So we're already undertaking surveys, roadside surveys, we're collecting data, we're trying to understand through what I would call modelling and limited data sets. This opportunity is not about necessarily finding more money, it's about spending what we have more wisely and transitioning to using a richer data set, which just by chance is becoming available, and also then not modelling, but actually understanding the demand in a statistically valid way. So it's not about more cash, it's just about the adjustment in the way we spend it.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that. I think we've looked at the way that we collect data within our organisation, and there's lots of people collecting lots of little bits of data in a very expensive way. Actually, what we need to say is, what data do we need to drive our business models, to drive policy, to drive infrastructure design, and then begin to collect that in a much more systematic way. And that way, I think we'll save a lot of money. But you actually need to think about what data do you want.
Yeah, so from your perspective, Dan, what data do you already collect and how do you turn that into meaningful action? How is that changing?
So we've just finished a transport data audit. So we now know exactly what transport data we have within the organisation. What that's shown us is that we've actually got some key gaps, things like cycle data, pedestrian flow data. So what we're beginning to think about is the best way to collect that data, but also how we can take the silos that I talked about earlier and kind of move towards a much more unified infrastructure, so that we're getting the data that we need. Now, whether that's on a lamp column or whether it's through mobile data, we need to kind of understand the best and most efficient way to collect that.
Yeah, so I guess that's one for you two, Fraser and Stephen. How can we understand actual demand for public services?
Yeah, I mean, we're here to talk about the way things are at the moment. I mean, let's be honest, 70% of the information on our movements is in commercial hands. And we need to move to a much more sharing economy. And a lot of the innovation from our last couple of years of work is about bringing the data back into the community for its use. And clearly, in addition to that, we can also persuade the citizens to actually share their data more easily, of course, under the fact that it's public safety and GDPR compliant. But this is an opportunity to actually engage more deeply with people in the local community.
Yeah, should we touch on that then, the GDPR thing? Because I know it'll be on everyone's minds. How does this comply with GDPR? What are the privacy concerns that are related to this?
Yeah, so from a GDPR perspective, I mean, Vodafone's been involved in a compliance program around GDPR for the past 5 years. So this has been a kind of a massive moment for a big organisation like Vodafone. You know, we're global. We take data privacy, data security incredibly seriously. So we've had a big compliance program around that. Everything that we do here obviously complies with all the existing GDPR regulation, as well as the next essence, I guess, of it that's probably coming as well. But I think the important thing, the data that we are working on as part of this program, it's anonymised. All of the results are aggregated, expanded or synthesised to the total population. So what's actually made available to the local government for their insight purposes is not considered personal information, personal data. So there's a certain kind of sort of liability exposure that these organisations are kind of insulated from by working with this type of data. So, yeah.
Well, give us some examples then of what you've done, which councils you've worked with perhaps, or what kind of improvements and benefits you've delivered so far, so our audience can put, more tangible face to it.
Maybe look at it 3 levels. Firstly, on the national level, we're seeing an interest now in the Office for National Statistics at using the data supplementary to the census. So traditionally, in the last census, we were asked a series of questions: where do you live? Where do you work? Now that's a very expensive way of gathering that information. So what the white paper, and if you go to the ONS website, you will find this paper. It's about using the type of data we've just described at a national level. If I move you down a level to regional, they recently conducted a public inquiry in Wales, which was to understand what South Wales looks like and the options for it, was the first virtual public inquiry with no physical data collection. And that's created a transport model which is substantively better than what's existed. But if I take you down a further level, and I think it's probably more relevant to our other speaker, is really what it can then be done. But I can just give you one simple example: understanding car park movement. How do you arrive in a city? Where do you park? How do you end up in the city centre? That gives you a sense of the opportunity in front of us. But clearly, at a local authority level, there are a lot more opportunities than that.
Yeah, and when we're using data to begin to really quantify and understand the city so that we can understand how traffic flows, how car parks fill up, the impact that it has on air quality. And I think the real value comes when you begin to join all these data sets together and get a really good insight into how the city's operating. And then once you do that and you've got historic data, you can begin to use machine learning techniques so you can pick up patterns, and then you can begin to predict. And if you can predict things that are going to happen, then you can begin to think about how you can adapt things like your infrastructure, traffic signals, variable messaging sign at the edge of town, so that you can either ease traffic flow or you can begin to give people messages and nudge their behaviour. So we're really interested in how you supplement the data that you collect with intelligence that really helps you to understand the decisions that people make. And once you understand those decisions, can you nudge behaviour?
And we know it's not even just related to transport, is it? What are some other sectors or some other benefits that you found related to different services?
So, I think the use of data is going to be key in energy infrastructure. So we know that the energy grid around Cambridge is almost at capacity. It's going to be a long process to upgrade that infrastructure. So actually, can we use the infrastructure that we've got better? Can we do something called load balancing, where you look to where all your energy loads are, when you've got demand, and basically you dim fridges in big industrial units or industrial processes, so that at times of high demand you can kind of manage the grid better. I think where this becomes really interesting is once you get more electric vehicles into the city and they become part of the grid, so they can act like batteries. And all of that is based on sharing data between different buildings, cars, infrastructure. And the other really interesting area is health and social care. So actually, being able to understand how people live. People have come out of hospital. Are they drinking? Because unfortunately, people get readmitted into hospital because they're not drinking enough. Are they getting up? Are they putting the kettle on? Are they eating? Are they moving around their home? Are they taking their medicine? And all of that can be done with sensors and connectivity. So it's using the Internet of Things within somebody's home to really understand, how they're living and trying to prevent some of those things that mean that people have to go back into hospital.
And there's big cost savings around that as well, isn't it, right? Because the cost of admitting someone into long-term care as opposed to allowing them to, to live in their own property is is far greater, right? So some of the cost savings that you were sort of referring to.
Absolutely, and I think what we're seeing is the cost of connectivity in those sensors is actually coming down as well. So the cost of deployment is coming down for the local authority. It's just trying to find the right model that gives you the reassurance that you need that those sensors are giving you a true reading. Because the worst thing that could happen is that a sensor keeps telling you that someone's fallen over and that it hasn't. So I think there's quite a lot of work to do to make sure that we've got a robust framework. But actually, I think there's huge potential in the future.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting. I mean, transport planning, urban planning were the obvious ones, right? Because it was, understanding sort of how people interact with cities and with infrastructure. But sort of health and well-being is coming up a lot now on local authorities' agenda, right? I mean, how do you make people, fitter, healthier, less sedentary time? Encourage them to walk, cycle. To mitigate some of the kind of forthcoming sort of social care costs, which are a concern as well. Do you? I mean, I sort of also find that it's the data giving you this kind of understanding of how the city's functioning now. Is it sort of moving you to being more sort of, as opposed to being reactionary, to being more predictive? Because I think historically people were more reactionary to problems as opposed to being able to determine the state of a city in a few hours' time or minutes' time.
Yeah, so I think we're kind of on the beginning of that journey. We've got a key collaboration with the University of Cambridge. So we've got 2 people within the computer labs at the university who are beginning to look at this kind of machine learning idea and how we can do predictions in the future. So I think it is still early days, but that's where we want to get to. We want to understand, how we can use data to really begin to address some of the issues of congestion that we've got, how we can understand air quality and the relationship between the two, and actually, what policies or what infrastructure do you put in place to begin to address it? Because data is really interesting, but it's not the thing. The thing is what you do at the end of it with that data.
The meaningful action and what you extract out of it, And I mean, I don't know how you do it in Cambridge, but with regards to Vodafone and Citi Logik, how do you deliver this information? Is it Internet of Things network, 5G? What infrastructure are you harnessing to deliver these services?
Yeah, I think the first point I'm going to make is whatever we're going to do in the future, we have to prove now. It's okay to look at what's about to happen, but we've got to do it with the 3 and 4G networks, for example, that would exist. Because this is going to be hard work. I mean, as you've alluded to, the AI work is going to be challenging. And it's got to be done locally as well, recognising the local conditions. So we've got to start with baselining what we have now. We've got to start understanding things like journey time reliability around the city, the ability to run services and also to access services. Once we have an understanding of where we are, it's possible then to look to where we want to go. But as with everything else in life, you've got to have the evidence to make change. And I think that's what we're actually creating at the moment.
I just want to pick up on something there actually. So what was really interesting was within Cambridge there were some roadworks that shut off one of the key routes, Mill Road in Cambridge recently. And cars weren't able to travel down there. Now, wouldn't it be really interesting if you were then to be able to say, well, what happened to the rest of the road network during that time? Actually, if we're looking at beginning to restrict car travel into the city, being able to understand as we do roadworks or as roads are closed, the impact that it has on the rest of the road network, that really does help inform possible policies as you move forward.
But let me at this point, I was lucky enough to go to Copenhagen recently, and the statistics are this: in this country, if you live in an urban area, you will live 5 years less than you would if live in the country. I mean, that is a government statistic. If you go to Copenhagen, you will live 5 years longer in an urban area than in a rural area because they introduced the cycling, and people are much healthier because of that. So there is a real benefit to be gained in the mortality rate of our citizens, and that is why modal shift and changing behaviour is absolutely critical to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to add anything to that, Fraser?
No. I mean, we're seeing a big movement at the moment around pedestrianisation. So inside of London, there's been quite a lot of pedestrianisation over the last few years. There's a consultation going on around pedestrianising Oxford Street, which I think has been rejected in its current form, right? But I completely agree that if you have this ability to implement a policy, be it close a road or a piece of infrastructure, whether it's as for planned or due to roadworks, the ability to kind of analyse the performance of that change immediately, right? You've got some roadworks going on, trying to predict the impact that it's going to have, making sure that you put steps in place to reduce that impact, and then to be able to measure while that activity is taking place, to be able to measure the impact that's having it's something that you've never been able to do before as a local government.
And the evidence base that you're building is enormous, isn't it? Because you're collecting information 24/7 of everything citizens do. What are the challenges in that, and what are the real benefits of this 24-hour staying online kind of way of going about it?
I mean, there's the getting away from the kind of surveys, obviously. I mean, the business that we first got into when we did this was, how do we get away from doing roadside surveys? They're statistically, tiny, questionable. They disrupt traffic, which is kind of an irony there when you sort of cause a traffic problem to try and understand a traffic problem. But initially, it was really around, it was trying to get rid of these surveys. And when we spoke to councils, I think we find that they all say, I'm not getting the answers that I want from surveys, right? So there's still a role for surveying of certain questions, but I don't think that they are giving you the understanding in totality. So this ability to basically analyse everything that's going on everywhere, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without any physical infrastructure, without any disruption to that system, creates a completely different way of understanding that infrastructure, but also the kind of the time and the cost of getting those results is greatly reduced, right? You can do something on a Tuesday, you can measure the impact of it, the next day, later that week, or potentially while it's happening.
And how would you say what we do now, how does it compare to these legacy methods that we use, such as roadside surveys? Do you think there's still a value in having these surveys, or is it purely data driven nowadays? Well, this is one for everyone, really.
Well, let me go back to the recent work in Wales. So, with the work to create the new model, we've seen a significant increase in the accuracy of the model, rising from 60 to 80 to 90%, and that's because we're starting to understand the through movement, the local movement, the relationship of the network to, let's say, the Amazon effect of now all these vehicles moving around delivering, as Fraser alluded to, changing in work patterns. So getting a grip of that is very important. Once we understand that dynamic, we can start to look at the change. But I don't think we should kid ourselves. This is changing all the time. And what exists today will not be the same as exists in 18 months or 3 years as other things happen. But having a handle on the totality over time allows us to really get to grips with it.
And that rate of change is accelerating, I think. I think we look at things coming, self-driving autonomous vehicles. The impact of cycling. The whole kind of dynamics of sort of health and well-being. So what you're going to see is I think, a lot more change happening much faster over a period of time. How do you operate, a city, an environment, infrastructure that's in constant change, constant flux? And that's a probably bigger problem than we're going to solve today, but having an understanding of how that system is performing and being able to constantly adapt it is certainly part of the solution.
What would you say, Dan, from your perspective?
So, I think there's a couple of important points there. Change is happening so rapidly that for a local authority it can be quite difficult to know when to jump. When do you invest in this? When do you really start to bring it into business as usual? When does it go from being a pilot or a trial or something that you're just kind of playing with? And that's quite difficult. The other one is around infrastructure. So, we as a council, there was a 25-year PFI for our lump post infrastructure. And at that time, no one was thinking, actually, you've got this ubiquitous kind of network of things that are connected and have got power, and that you'll be able to use them to collect air quality data, or be able to collect road data. You'd be able to use them for all sorts of things, potentially for 5G base stations or small cells. It's now become almost a barrier to doing some of those things. And, so how will infrastructure change? When you're going out to procure, how long should you be procuring for? We know that traffic signal infrastructure may change radically over the next 10 to 15 years, particularly as, connected and autonomous cars become a major part of the road network. So how do we, future-proof what we're doing now?
Yeah, I was going to add, I've been working in the Northern Powerhouse, and we have all these changes we want to make, but there's also something that runs across all of them, which is quality of life. You can't just make change to make things faster and faster. There has to be a reason for doing it. And I think what we've also got to do is look at less movements and placing assets in different locations. Because if we can achieve a 10% modal shift, then things can be better. I mean, we know that inherently, because during the school holidays, we see that the roads are drivable. But of course, as soon as the kids go back to school, it changes again. But if we can get that shift embedded into each city, at least in the short term, we can reduce the level of stress on the system.
How would you approach a council that isn't, like your council was already quite data-driven, how would you approach a council that doesn't have that expertise? Maybe their staff isn't data-driven already, they don't have the training, they don't have the open mind even sometimes to take on these projects. How would you go about that? Maybe one for you, Fraser or Stephen. Cause
I mean, from our perspective, you do see the broad spectrum, right? So
Yeah.
you do have some local authorities who are probably much kind of early on in that sort of journey, and you've got others who are far more sophisticated. Cambridge, Islington, people like that. Camden.
Camden.
So you've got the sort of the different examples there. I mean, with all of these conversations, it's around trying to understand what the problem is that city or that client is actually struggling with, and then usually there's a range of solutions, right? Be it IoT, be it data, be it connectivity, be it partners as well. So you've already got to very much start with what is the problem inside of that organisation, help them solve that problem. I think what we're finding is that everyone is scrambling to become more data-centric and bringing in data science and this kind of thing. And we're sort of, from the other side, we're trying to make the data and the tools more insight-driven, right? So you don't have to worry about the heavy kind of data science underpinning. You're actually putting information and tools that can enable people to make decisions in the hands of the actual decision maker. So we're trying at both angles, working with the sophisticated, working with the less sophisticated, but ultimately it's around trying to put information and tools in the hands of everybody, right? Really democratizing this insight that enables them to make the decision that's ultimately going to fix the problem.
And I think that's really important. So as organisations, we've not been data-driven for a long time, so actually those skills aren't there. So being able to create an interface which is as easy as possible for people to use and for people to interrogate, I think that's key. Yep. Because otherwise, we can have all the data we want. If we don't have the skills and the ability to use it, then it just won't be used.
And that silo thing that you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, we've had the amount of times we've had someone, planning guy in the council come down, he'll throw a 100-page transport assessment on the table and say, you've got to help me, right? I mean, I'm paying all this money, I'm getting this wedge of paper that nobody understands apart from the transport planning consultancy world, right? So how do you get to a world where you can engage communities, you can really enable people inside the council to make a decision without having to be some expert in some very kind of technical kind of world, right? So really trying to put the answers and the information, and you see it everywhere. Everybody is trying to get data into a state that can be understood by people who are non-data savvy as well.
Yeah. So how would you do that, Dan? Do you get everybody in the room? How did you get your staff to really engage with that data and take something meaningful from it?
So what we found really useful was through the data audit process was getting everybody around a table and to begin to start just talking about data, about how they want to use it, what data sets they would like. And actually what we found was that people had data that other people wanted, but they didn't know that, because that just happens in a big organisation.
So communication,
And so what we're hoping to do is kind of create a single point that we can put all the data that's collected so that people can discover it and start to reuse it. I think there are questions about data quality and how do you get people to understand, how data was collected and actually the quality of that data, because I think that's quite important. But just getting people to start to think about the data they need, where it might sit within the organisation, and just starting to use it is the best place to start. It's just doing it, and then from that you can kind of grow your strategy.
Did you find that you had any pushback from the wider public when you started getting involved with this more data collection, even though it's anonymised? Did you find there was a pushback that you had to either fight against or explain to the public, this is why it's going to benefit you, this is anonymised, get everything clear for them?
So, I mean, Cambridge is quite a kind of data-savvy place.
Yeah.
So, our residents are quite engaged in this kind of agenda. So I get people tweeting me all the time saying, what's this camera, what data is it collecting? And then, when we can find out, we've run hackathons, so we've got people to come and work on our data. We've got an open data platform, Cambridgeshire Insights, which I think is really important, making as much data open as possible. Get people using it, and actually, the tools that we've got internally, putting it into the hands of residents as well, so that they can begin to pick up and easily use data, so they can understand, as well, how the city's operating. And then it becomes a conversation, a two-way conversation. It's not councils saying, right, we're going to do this, and we've run the numbers and it works. It's about actually, this is the data that we've used, look at it as well, and, and then we can have a meaningful conversation based on that.
Yeah, and from the perspective of Vodafone and Citi Logik, how do you deal with that? public response, anonymity, privacy.
Yeah, I mean, the core tenets of our strategy have always been transparency and choice, right? You've got to be open about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and ultimately you've got to give people the choice as to whether or not they want to be involved in this way. So Vodafone continues to be the only mobile operator in the UK who allows its customers to opt out of this aggregated, anonymised data collection. So that's always something that we've had as an organisation. People do exercise that right, and then we've always tried to be as transparent as we can. I mean, I think the complexity is it's a very complex topic. Using data to run cities, it doesn't really mean much to most normal people. So it's one of these weird things where you're trying to engage, you're trying to be transparent, but trying to explain it in a way is incredibly complex. But we've always had information on our website that's sort of plain language explains it. We give people ultimately the choice. We do external audits. We do a ton of stuff to make sure that although we're collecting this information, we're always maintaining people's anonymity. We're depersonalising it. It's not about people. It's not about individuals. It's about the kind of mass society and sort of group as a whole. And I think ultimately, if you are going to do stuff with data that belongs to your customers, if you're using that data to help councils, local government, make better decisions faster, well, that's a great application. I think there'd be very few citizens who were, resistant to their data being used for that sort of use case. Yeah. I think once you start identifying people and sending them spam and all this kind of stuff, I think that's where it becomes, kind of annoying or kind of onerous.
On that note, actually, there's a really interesting question from the audience here. It looks like a lot of different councils are considering collecting data on movements into and within urban areas. Do Vodafone, Citi, Logik, and other mobile operators already have this data? Can it be shared with councils? And do you intend to make it available to others?
So let me just we've been on a journey for a number of years, but last year we were backed by Innovate to build baseline capability and real-time capability. But we've gone about this very thoughtfully. Innovation isn't just technological, it's also about licensing the data and meaningful use. And we've come up with, through the first-of-a-kind process with Innovate, what we believe is a way of it being used in the community, for the community, population-based pricing, and an ability for them to have a clear return on investment within that community. But there are some rules to the game. The rules are, we all agree to a common purpose that is public good, we all treat it well, and we ultimately must all collectively show the value to the people who ultimately are providing that data. That has been backed again in the last couple of weeks with Innovate providing long-term loans, but we believe we've got a way of creating a sharing community where this data is actually going to be used on a consistent basis, and it's not about the economic gain for one party who may or may not be based in this country.
Do you want to add to that, Fraser? Question from the audience?
From a historical perspective, we have a sort of 12 months of history, right? So we can effectively do any project that looks at a year at its entirety, and then obviously the work that we're doing with Steve, they're now able to kind of process this data in kind of near real time as well. So you can do historical understanding, you can do baselining, and then you can do an understanding of changes over time as well.
Yeah.
If you just add one point, it's also accountability. Whenever we do something, we don't just assume we have the data, we have to ask for it. And Fraser has to agree to it, and we have to agree that data is then used for the purpose to which we've acquired it. Now, once it's been used, that is the end of it, unless we then have another requirement from the public sector to use it. If you don't have that sort of dynamic, you may then decide to use the data for purposes which would be well beyond the scale, and we do not cross that line. That line is very important to everyone.
You're not just sitting on a mountain of black gold. That's great.
No, it's purpose limitation, it's known as under GDPR, right? You only collect stuff that you've got a reason to process, and then that reason that you process it has to be clearly articulated up front, which is a very sensible approach.
Absolutely. And Daniel, there's one for you here, which is interesting as well. Do you have a smart cities program as well as a digital program, or have they combined into one big rolling program in the council?
So we have a connectivity program, which I kind of sit along, or the Smart Cities program sits alongside. There is a transformation program internally, and we're at the moment, we talk to them a lot and trying to work out kind of where they sit and where we sit. But I think the most important thing is, we're all doing good stuff, and we just need to talk to each other and share learning and lessons and work out kind of how it all fits together, because it's, what we don't want to do is create a smart cities silo, because that's not the point of smart cities, is to break out of silos. So, local authorities are complex things. We have we have district councils, we have county councils, we have combined authority, we have a body that's there to deliver the city deal, and so we're trying to work out how we work with all these different people, the relationships. But I think it's really important that we move away from this replicating infrastructure, replicating data collection, because we do need to save money, and it just doesn't make any sense. So there's a lot of kind of conversations internally and sort of collaborative work.
And this is one for you as well. You two can't answer this one. Do you think the public sector can do this without the help from the private sector?
So no, I firmly believe that this is a collaboration, not just between the public sector and the private sector, but also academia. I think things are moving so quickly, and actually some of the technologies that we're looking at are so complex that a lot of the knowledge and understanding sits within the private sector. So it would make no sense not to collaborate. I also think that local authorities shouldn't be delivering things like apps and that sort of, the private sector does it better. So what we should be doing is kind of, creating a market for that sort of thing by getting our data into a position where we can share it, and it's there for, people to come up. I mean, it's what we've seen with the London Data Store and City Mapper, and, hopefully we'll see a lot more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually quite a specific question here, but one that you two might be able to answer. Can data from cyclists and pedestrians be separated from motorized user data? And how is that done? Do you have any examples of that being done before, or is it lumped into one big thing?
Yeah, there are some modes that are trickier than others.
Yeah.
And cycling is one of them, because a person can be considered both cycling, a vehicle, and also a pedestrian. Now, there are many ways to determine this, but it's also what's reasonable as well. I mean, you could take it extreme and say we're going to CCTV every cyclist in the city. But that's not a reasonable thing to do. The most obvious thing to do is to focus around people who are on the cycle highways. And there are techniques then to work out where these people have come from and where they're going to. But it's ultimately about the level of intrusiveness and the level of activity to determine the outcome. I mean, clearly, if people voluntarily put stuff on their bikes, which is good, then that's another way. We can take Strava as an example. But it's all about coming up with something that everyone feels comfortable with, without disregard for their privacy.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen, obviously in London, I assume it's other cities around the UK as well, we've seen the emergence of these, these kind of shared floating bike schemes, OFO and these things, Mobike. Obviously those, those assets produce a huge amount of data, right? I mean, every person that gets on it has a smartphone. That smartphone is probably producing a whole lot of insight. So I would be surprised if you were a local authority and you were deploying a scheme like that. As part of the deployment, you wouldn't mandate that data has to be made available to the city for that purpose, right? And I think starting to think about, when these new things come along that are producing data, be it City Mapper, be it a biking system, that data is in some way fed back into that system for the benefit of all, right? And these kind of data ecosystems, London Data Store is a good example. That's when you really start maximising the benefit, because you bring two pieces of data together. That equals 5, right? It's far better than these things, kind of individually on their own.
Well, you keep mentioning London. Do you feel like the other parts of the country, I wouldn't say need catching up, but are you targeting them a bit more? Do you think they have a longer road to travel?
Yeah, so DFT did a piece of work about a year ago about big data, and they identified that the core area is not necessarily the large cities who will come up with good solutions, but it's in the nicest possible way, the middle ground. The Tier 2 and Tier 3 populations of 100, 500,000 people. And the reason we were supported by Innovate was to develop models for that area, because there isn't the natural level of funding or technology to operate at that level. So I think for us all to operate effectively, we've not only got to do it at the top end of the market, the big cities, but we've also got to give it to a community of 100,000 who may not be as well advantaged, because travel poverty and health poverty are probably more frequent in those areas of the smaller cities than they may be on the larger ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I have another specific question here, and then we'll move on just to talk about Cambridge for a bit. So someone who sits on the private sector side of the fence, what have been your experiences using mobile data in support of planning applications? Is that a big one?
We've not used it so much in the sense of, there's two types of planning, right? Residential planning, where I don't think the mobile phone data is that applicable. In the kind of the planning of major infrastructure, we've done a huge number of projects in that space where the data has helped inform the decision around changes to that infrastructure, Heathrow, the M4, some fairly big projects in that space. So it's used primarily on these kind of large infrastructure projects to support the modelling of change to a piece of infrastructure. And as we mentioned before, while that infrastructure is being changed, you also have the ability to understand the amount of disruption impact that it's being caused.
Absolutely. Do you want to add to that, Steve?
Yeah, I know the big schemes are important, but recently we've been talking to a developer who's looking not only to build something new, but also persuade the local authority to move the assets that are nearby inside that new build, so that there's reduced need for cars. So actually, there is a very significant opportunity to use this in what may be regarded as a small incremental activity within the city, but ultimately the net outcome will be very good for everyone. So I do see it as a natural place to use it, on the basis that we obviously can prove the return on investment to the developer.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're just coming through to the last few minutes of the webinar. It's flown by. Just wanted to focus a bit on the council side of things, because obviously you two are, want to have local authorities getting involved. From your perspective, what advice could you give to these local authorities that perhaps are just beginning their journey or are a bit in the dark of how to go about it? What advice could you give out? What lessons have you learned so far?
Yeah, so, I think the first thing is to really understand what your challenges are. So, really dig into it and understand what the challenges and what kind of behaviours are leading to some of those challenges. So why do people drive? Why won't they get out their cars and use the bus? To really kind of dig into it. I think understanding what natural assets you have as an organisation, what data you have, what skills you have, collaboration, particularly local collaboration, getting out there and networking. So one of the first things that we did was we went out and we met as many people as we could. We talked to all the companies in our area who were involved in this space, built relationships, really tried to understand what was going on. What were the possibilities of some of the new kind of technologies that were emerging. Building links with academia, so we're really lucky having the University of Cambridge on our doorstep. Which is great. They're actually doing a whole load of research in this area, so we can go to people and we can say, look, we've heard about this thing called blockchain actually, but what does it mean? How could we use it in the city? So I think using those kind of natural assets has been key. There's a whole load of organisations as well who are thinking about this. There's the catapults, the digital catapult, the Future Cities catapult. Going and meeting them and talking to them about some of the work that they're doing. We've been partnering with business on Innovate UK bids, which has always been really beneficial for us because it allows you to experiment and actually fail, which is really important, which is quite difficult within a local authority environment. So, I think you just have to get on and do it and talk to as many people as you can. There are cities out there who have already, done all this work. There's Oxford and Milton Keynes have done a lot, and Manchester and Glasgow. So, talk to other cities. Come and talk to us. We talk to cities all the time.
Yeah, so, your doors are open then.
Yeah, they are, absolutely.
There's actually a question from the audience here. Do you have a set of objectives for your Smart Cities programme, or do you develop them as you go along? Honesty time.
So actually we've kind of got a forward programme of objectives, but it does change quite a lot, as opportunities arise. But the key areas that we're concentrating on is making the data better and opening up our data, making it more usable. Autonomous vehicles are a really interesting area for us, particularly first and last mile. So we've got a big project that will be kicking off shortly. Mobility as a service, that idea of bringing together all the different modes, making it as easy as possible to use transport, and this idea of it being a kind of a Netflix model where you don't own, you rent. I think that could have a significant impact, again underpinned by data. There's objectives, things that we want to achieve. There's a program, but it's a fairly flexible thing.
So I think I know the answer to this, but do you think it's been worth the time getting this data, collecting this data, extracting meaning from it, spending that maybe a bit of extra money at first to have this foresight in the future? Do you think it's been worth it?
I do. I mean, I don't think there are any cities that, apart from London, who are really advanced in this field. We're all beginning to, learn, and it's going to take time. But I think it's, from what we've seen so far, there were some huge benefits that we'll see over the next couple of years from doing it.
Yeah, perfect. So Fraser, this is one for you. Obviously, the audience here is watching for a reason. be good to give them the next steps. How can local authorities get involved? What is Vodafone and what are Citi Logik going to be doing the next few months, maybe?
Yeah, so the next couple of months, we would like to run a small number of kind of regional workshops. So we'll visit some different areas around the country. We would love it if some of the people listening today could come along to these workshops. The intent will be probably, I think, the level below what we're talking about today, right? So getting a bit more kind of hands-on, with the tech, with the data, looking at some of the kind of problems that the people attending that event, specifically the types of things that they are grappling with. So yeah, it'd be great if people could join one of these workshops. They'll be quite intimate, small number of places. So yeah, we'd love it if people come along and join those and learn a bit more and share the experience, right? I mean, we're the same as you. We sometimes find ourselves as this kind of broker of learnings and experience, right? I think we were either brave or kind of foolish enough to kind of be first, but we've learned a lot. We're learning a lot more, and I think having this kind of open dialogue, sharing things, trying to make it accessible. We get all of the challenges that local authorities are kind of dealing with, and we're open to finding ways of overcoming all of that. Yeah.
So how can they actually get in touch with your team if they want to attend one of these workshops or maybe work in the future?
So I think, are they going to send an email out, I think, after this event with a link? So click on the link, register for one of the workshops, and you'll get to see us in the flesh talking about it at a lower level of detail.
All right, brilliant. Do you guys want to offer any closing thoughts, any advice that you want to give to viewers today, or anything you want them to take home with?
I just say one thing. I mean, information is like electricity. When you turn the light on, you expect a certain level of luminescence. I mean, this is all about creating quality quickly, because the issue is not the data, it's what you do with it and the outcomes. Because with the levels of pollution we have, the levels of deprivation we have, we really need to solve those problems. This is part of a process of helping an authority like Cambridge to actually do its job.
Yeah, that's a perfect note to end it on, I think. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. As I mentioned, if your question wasn't answered, I'm sure they'd be happy to take it offline. More than happy to assume. So thank you very much for being with us today, and goodbye.